Thank you everybody for coming. Great to be here and hear about all the work that's going on in this area. I will just tell you a bit about me. So I qualified as a vet very strangely. I started my training with Joe, and I have very fond memories of canoeing around the swimming pool in our Freshers' Week. And then I did 2 years in practice and then moved into research, and I can assure you that having a long research history doesn't protect you from imposter syndrome. But I worked in animal health research, and now in the last few years I've decided to move into human wellbeing research. So I'm now working in the Workforce Organisation and Wellbeing Group at Surrey. So using all of my experience together to look at improving the wellbeing of vets. So what am I going to talk about? Very, very briefly for this audience, just going to talk about how, just to give some context of where what we've done fits into what we know about mental health in vets, and then talk about what we've done, and that'll be the main focus of the talk, and then how that might contribute to improving mental health and wellbeing in the future. So what do we know? Increased risk of suicide in vets, which we've heard about, and we heard about some of the specific factors in the veterinary profession that might contribute to that, so having access to means and suicide contagion. But what I'm really going to focus on is the more general kind of link between mental ill health and suicide. So we know that mental ill health increases the risk of suicide in the veterinary profession and in other professions. And we know from a lot of work carried out, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but one particular example is a survey carried out in the UK 10 years ago that looked at the impact of workplace environment on mental health, which is what we've been talking about. And that study also found a link between workplace environment and mental well-being. And that's really where we're going to focus our work. So it's looking at trying to unpack that relationship between the workplace environment and mental health and well-being. And this is based on a recommendation in the MRC framework for the development of complex interventions, which talks about needing to have a theoretical understanding of the process of change. So that's what we're trying to look at. How exactly does workplace environment influence mental health? So what aspects of the workplace environment are most important? How do those interact to lead to mental health issues or to protect mental well-being, and what are the factors that might modify those relationships? So just talking about what we did. So this is we did a scoping review. So we did a systematic search of the literature to identify articles, and then applied selection criteria to identify those that were particularly relevant to our question or standard stuff. And then we extracted data from those articles. So we identified 56 articles that were relevant to our question. And we extracted data on all the separate analyses that were carried out in those articles. So some of those articles included maybe a qualitative and a quantitative study. Some of them included different mental health outcomes. So we developed coding structures for mental ill health and well-being. And I should have said this in the previous slide, actually. I was going to say, so I'm using a broader definition of mental ill health than Joe just used. So my definition of mental ill health includes both the occupational stress that Joe talked about, measured with burnout and other measures, and also a more general measure of psychological distress like depression and anxiety, because as Joe said, there is some overlap between those, and what we're really interested in is getting a broad view of what are the factors that are increasing the risk of mental ill health. And we did the same thing for well-being, so used a broad definition of well-being that includes a number of different measures of well-being. And then we did a thematic analysis so in our articles we looked at all the aspects of work that had been described in those studies and classified those according to whether they're about the actual content of the work, so the nature of the task carried out, things like the amount of work, the workload, emotional demands, responsibility demands, and also the context, so things like organisational culture and structure, and also whether they were having a positive or a negative impact on mental health. So, and then we looked at all the different aspects of work within each of those categories. And once we'd done that, we were able to identify the articles that were looking at a range of different aspects of the workplace. So we wanted, because we're interested in which ones are most important, we wanted to look at those articles that identified a range of different factors. So we ended up with 58 separate analyses in our articles. And then we divided them into categories based on our mental health outcomes. So whether they were looking at mental health or well-being, that's the top and the bottom, and whether they were descriptive. So whether they were studies that were saying, what do you find stressful in your job? Which could be either qualitative studies, which ask questions like, what are the most stressful things about your job? What are the most satisfying things about your job? Or quantitative studies, which looked at, so they gave people a list of factors and said, how stressful do you find these various aspects? That was our first group. That's all the descriptive ones, which are trying to identify what are the sources of stress. And the second group was the analytical ones, which actually measured aspects of the workplace and then associated that to a measure of mental ill health or well-being. So results. So starting off, looking at what is the impact of the workplace on mental ill health and looking at our stressful job content factors. So this graph just looks at what percentage of the analyses that we looked at identified each of these different aspects of the workplace as being stressful. And what you can see there is that, so the blue bars are about descriptive studies and the orange bars are about analytical. So in general, the descriptive studies, so just identifying what's stressful, found associations, stronger associations with all of these aspects of the workplace. We've got associations with a wide variety of different types of demand. And the only one where we got an equal evidence in both the analytical and descriptive studies was the workload, and I'll talk a bit more about that and why that might be in a minute. So then if we also look at the job context, we've also got there again a range of different aspects of the workplace that are stressful to vets, both in the descriptive and analytical, but again more so in the descriptive. Then if we look at our protective factors that we've called job rewards here, we've got less of an association between these protective factors, so less evidence that these are and this time we're looking at whether they protect mental ill health, whether they make it lower. And then we've got the same relationships looked at for the relationship between the work environment and mental well-being. So here you can see on the right-hand side of the graph, you've got more associations, as you would expect, with the protective factors, and you've also got associations with the work demands, but more so in the analytical studies that are looking at associations. So people don't tend to investigate ask people whether it's the demands that are reducing their well-being. There's much more focus on the protective effects for well-being. So just to summarise what this shows us, we've got a range. So we looked at which job demands are associated with mental ill health in more than 50% of either our analytical or our descriptive studies. So you've got a range of job demands, both context and context, that are associated with mental ill health. And you've got a range of protective factors that tend to be associated strongly with mental well-being. And what we also found was that workload and work-life balance have a strong association with mental well-being. And then what some of our studies also looked at, just a few of the studies looked at, does a high level of the protective factors modify the impact of your demands? So for instance, there was one study that looked at people with high levels of organisational support. Emotional demands had less impact on them than those with lower levels of support. And the final thing that a few of our studies, and this is in line with what Joe was saying, looking at the interaction between individual factors and organisational factors. So a few studies also looked at what's the impact of individual characteristics. Does that modify the impact of your demand? So we weren't particularly focusing in this review on the individual characteristics, but we just looked at where they modified the impact of job demands. And there were several studies that looked at coping strategies. So if people used a problem-solving coping strategy, then emotional demands had less impact, and also things like professional identity. So a challenge-focused professional identity had seemed to make the responsibility and emotional demands have less impact on people. So that's a summary of all the, it looks a bit complicated, which is why I built it up slowly, but it's all the relationships that we found in our data. And then we wanted to look at to what extent is this similar to what's predicted by the existing theories about stress, so that idea from the MRC recommendation that you need to base your ideas about the process on existing theories. So we looked at the existing theories. So the first one was the job demand control support model, which a few people have mentioned. This is one that was developed in the 1970s and really focuses on the relationship between workload and occupational stress and the impact that job control and support can have on that relationship. So it's very much focused on workload. Another model that was developed at a similar time is the effort-reward imbalance model, again focused on workload and the combination of workload and individual motivation, so bringing in individual factors and looking at how that's balanced with the rewards that you get from work, so the financial and other rewards. And then the next step in these theories was transactional theories, which brought in more about individual factors, so more about coping strategies and how that might modify your demands, the impact of demands on mental ill health. And then just talking about the model that Joe talked about, so this job demand resources model, which came along more recently and is more flexible. And so that would allow you to look at the impact of a range of different demands and also a range of different rewards on, and this brings in mental well-being for the first time. So it's looking at mental health and mental well-being. And the last thing that this model does is allow you to look at the impact of individual characteristics. So if you look at that diagram, and I'm just going to show you again the diagram that we got from our data, what this shows is that by using a range of different theories, you can understand all the relationships in our data about the impact of different aspects of work on both mental ill health and mental well-being, but you do need to use a range of different theories. There are some bits that we didn't find in our data, mostly to do with individual characteristics, but that's because that wasn't the focus of what we were looking at. So, how does this fit with what we want to do next? So I think the long-term aim for everybody is to develop and identify interventions and then evaluate their impact. And again, really focusing, Joe really highlighted the fact that there are not very many organisational level interventions at the moment. So these should be both looking at, given our range of factors that impact on mental health, we're going to need a range of interventions focusing on different aspects, so including organisational and individual, and very much trying to focus on the prevention. So what we've done so far is to look at the factors in the workplace that have most impact that's going to help us to make sure that we target interventions on those factors in the workplace that are having most effect, which we would combine with thinking about which of those aspects can be changed and what interventions are available. So, and the idea about which aspects of the workplace can we change is really important when we're thinking about some of those modifying factors. If you've got a really important influence on a mental ill health that you can't change, then what can you do that can modify the impact of that factor? And the other thing that what we've done so far could contribute to is looking at what are the most important aspects of the workplace that we need to measure when we're doing evaluations. So it's going to inform us about some of the tools and so in the Netherlands, Nicole Marstenbroek developed the Vet DRQ, which is a really good tool that measures a range of different aspects of the workplace, but we can think about whether that measures everything that we found to be important. And combining that with tools to measure mental health and well-being would allow us, hopefully, to answer our important question about what's the impact of interventions on mental health and well-being. So just summarising the key points. So we have, by doing a very broad review, we've identified a range of workplace factors which have both positive and negative impacts on both mental ill health and well-being, which can inform the identification and development of interventions and tools to measure exposure to a range of different aspects of the work environment that's going to help us with our evaluation. And it really highlights the need to combine a variety of existing theories if we want to fully understand the relationship between the work environment and mental health and well-being. this suggests that future investigations should investigate a range of workplace factors, both in descriptive and analytical studies, that we need to consider factors that protect against mental ill health as well as stressors. Think about their impact both on mental well-being as well as on mental ill health, and organisational individual factors that can modify their impact. And it's also important to use appropriate tools to measure mental health. And also one thing that, because this was a scoping review, we didn't go into detail about the quality of the studies, but one of the things that was really sort of sprung out of the data is there was only one longitudinal study in all of these. And despite the fact that people have been talking about the need to do longitudinal studies for 10 years, it's still not something which, Rosie, yours longitudinal study, but and that wasn't in my data because I haven't got anything on it. But yeah, there are a few very good examples of longitudinal studies, but there's not a lot out there, and no quantitative longitudinal studies at the moment. So, and that's it from me.